All right, everybody. Thank you for joining our first ever episode of the Little Art Studio podcast. I'm here today with Starr Sariego, and I'm going to have her tell you a little bit about herself.
So, hello, everybody. I'm Starr. Ashlyn and I became friends many years ago through the Leica camera store in Miami. And I'm a photographer and a social justice activist, I guess you could say. A lot of my photography is based in photography for social change and creating photography exhibits that ask questions and stimulate interest for sort of underseen and underrepresented parts of our communities. And I started photography pretty late in life, in my early 50s. And I was going through a divorce and needed a new direction. And before that, I'd had a photo and film location company. So I was familiar with photography and making photographs. And here I am today, having you visit me in my home in Asheville, North Carolina.
Yeah. So my first kind of question for you is going to be, because I want to focus a little bit more on your curational aspect of what you do. So Starr does these brilliant exhibitions and kind of like collectives of different photographers and different creators to kind of unite around one topic. So I want to talk about that. Like, where was it in your journey where you were taking pictures either for yourself or, you know, just in general that you thought, okay, now I want to expand and kind of bring that together with other people and start working next to other photographers and kind of organizing through one unit, you know, as like a collection. That's right, kind of what I'm curious about. What was that kind of moment for you and what made you decide to go that direction?
So that's a good question. I think I would start by saying that in my life, I've always been involved in sort of volunteering and social justice and voting. And even in high school, it was something that I was very interested in, sort of activism in a sort of very small young person's way. And I was asked several years ago by a friend of mine who worked with a group called the Bold Beauty Project. And so they asked if I could coordinate a photography exhibit featuring women with disabilities. And I was super intrigued by the idea. So I, luckily, through our very early association and my sort of reach of photographer friends, I thought, okay, I'm going to invite a bunch of photographers to participate, assign them each a person to work with, one of the women who's part of the Bold Beauty Project. And it was I did a lot of research before I started because I really wanted everybody who touched the project to be sort of educated, changed, moved, impacted. So I came up with a little package for photographers that before they even spoke with the person they were going to photograph, that I asked them to meet with them a few times and get to know them, because the other thing I feel about these sort of portraits is that they should be very collaborative. I think the subject should have a lot to say in how they want to be portrayed, because what we're really doing is telling the story of the subject to the greater population. And so the photographers would meet, I sort of came up with this little, guidelines, I guess you could say, for the photographers. So they would first meet with the person, collaborate on what the image would look like, how the person wanted to be seen, and then they would make the image, and then the subject writes a narrative about their lives, mostly something that would fit on one page. Mm-hmm. So that was the very beginning, was putting this project together, and it was very powerful for me to see image and narrative together have a much greater impact for this sort of project than just an image.
I think that's super interesting that you were actually asked by somebody else to do it. I don't know why I thought you always kind of just initiated it and took off with it, but somebody came to you and asked you to do it.
Somebody came to me and said, would I be willing?
And then now you haven't stopped.
And now I haven't stopped. Yeah, it sort of was the template for what became a much more elaborate version of that.
And now you're, 3 or 4 collections deep of other photographers kind of collaborating together.
Yes.
Because you did the Bold Beauty, you did what was the next one?
The next one was the Compassion Project.
Yeah, that's the one that I did with you as well.
Which you did, yeah, formerly incarcerated women and their stories. And it's funny because I think that as a photographer who started sort of later in life, I really have a great case of imposter syndrome. Mm-hmm. So when I was working on the Bold Beauty Project, I was just going to coordinate the project and not make any portraits, even though I feel like portraiture is what I'm really strong in making. Mm-hmm. One of the young women, my friend Cynthia Fleischman, who's an amazing young person, had lost her leg in a motorcycle accident. Mm-hmm. And I had paired her with another photographer, and Cynthia called me after that session in tears and said, I hated it. Mm-hmm. I didn't feel connected. I didn't like the work. Mm-hmm. Would you please photograph me? So I ended up having one photo in that first exhibit. Mm-hmm. And so I felt very, kind of very confident about that because I really loved the image and I thought it stood up very well against a lot of the others.
It's super interesting you mention imposter syndrome because of starting at the age you started at, because I feel like on the reverse end, I have the imposter syndrome because I'm young. And a lot of people want to kind of look at me and my age and say like, well, what do you really know? You know, like you've not been around long enough to know enough about this. So that's a different type of struggle, I feel like, I don't know, that everybody experiences in different ways. I feel like every single artist I know has imposter syndrome.
Yes, I think that's very true. And then to get a little feministy about it, I think it's also sort of a women's issue. In my case in particular, I was not trained in art school and I did not get a university degree in photography. So I'm really mostly self-taught, took some courses at the university. But really, you know, it's funny, and I think you're right. I think it is very common amongst artists in particular. Yeah. So by the second project, I made 6 portraits of the 25. So I have been slowly trying to allow myself to say, you're good at this and do it. So
yeah, of course. And I think it's important too, because you're kind of curating the voice and the tone of the collection by sourcing everybody else's work and, you know, putting it all together. So I feel like your work being involved in it can kind of be a unifying factor of it as well. So I think it's important that you have, I think every single show you curate, you should have your own in it since you're the one that is putting it together. But I want to talk about the organization of it as well. So you sourcing all of these photographers, I want to know like how you find them, how do you connect with them? Because I mean, pulling together 25 different people it's a lot and over one topic too. So I'm curious about the sourcing of all of the images.
So there are many elements involved. The first is you're asking somebody to do you a huge favor because there are no budgets for these projects. They're really for the community-based, made for nonprofit organizations or made by myself with no funding. I have to fundraise for everything. So you're asking an artist to make something for no money. And the one thing that I have found super, super gratifying is a lot of the artists that I've worked with have said, we do so much commercial work or we do work for other people that, you know, they usually unite around the topic, you know, the particular sort of grounding point of the exhibit. And then they really do feel very happy to do something that it's their way of giving back. And for me, collaboration is huge. It's the one thing that I feel like I'm really fairly good at. So the photographers are easy to source because I just happen to know a lot of really gifted, wonderful photographers. And when I'm looking for photographers, and I'll use the Compassion Project, which was open in 2019 for 4 months at the Coral Gables Museum. And they were amazing. The curator there, Uni, was very, very supportive of the work because Uni had seen the first project at the Bakehouse in Miami. You know, sort of sourcing the photographers really wasn't the issue for me, funny enough. You know, and then they sort of gather around the subject. They're sort of inspired by it. They meet with the subject and Yeah. I know what I was about to say. I really apologize. Lost my train of thought there for a second. Doi. I really try to not only highlight a topic, like the subject of the photography, but I ask as many women and as many women of color or sort of photographers that don't even get so much of a platform all the time.
Right.
So that's another thing at the collaborative piece is I want to sort of uplift even the photographers. The idea is that, everybody gets touched by it. The photographer, the subject, and then the person looking at the image in the long run, how that works. As far as the groundwork, these projects take probably a year to a year and a half to put together because when you are coordinating 25 different photographers to work with 25 different subjects, you're working on everybody's time frames when they're available. Some of the photographs can be quite elaborate. Some, my friend Alexandria, who did the underwater photography. That was, those sort of projects take a long
production.
time. Yeah, they build a set, they drop it in the water.
Yeah.
It's a 8 or 9 hour day, like diving down in a pool. It's insane. It's so gratifying, this work, because and for me, I'm so turned on again by the collaboration piece. It's like I would go to a lot of the shoots myself and sort of observe them being made and, assist where needed. And it was pretty cool.
Yeah. And I think the variety that you get out of each person is so interesting. Like your last exhibition, The Skin I'm In, that was in Asheville. And I think it's super cool to see all of the different types of photography, like even just like my own in comparison to other people's and what they would produce. There were so many people who did self-portraits and so many people that, did either like a studio setup or they, there's just like photographing objects instead of people, what you get out of each photographer is so different, and yet they still like visually relate so well in every single exhibition that you've done, which is really impressive. And also kind of lucky too that everybody kind of, can come together and it looks cohesive.
Yeah, I think seeing or hearing, visually hearing other people's voices in their work makes it so much more interesting. The Compassion Project, so much more interesting to see what many different people, how somebody would approach a subject and how they would collaborate with the subject and then come up with whatever they came up with. Some were very stylized, some were very sort of commercial photography looking, some were very moody. I mean, you just got the range.
Too.
Yeah, exactly. The time that it takes to make the exhibit, we also build in the narrative piece. And with the Compassion Project, we made audio recordings. And so that was another part of it. We sort of built an app so that people could refer to the app, and there's a lot of learning and social justice stuff built in. So, I think with each one of these photography exhibits, they kind of grow in the components. You mentioned The Skin I'm In, a visual narrative of self. It sort of was a little bit of a derivative of what I had done with the other two exhibits in that it started as me making portraits for an oral history collection done through University of North Carolina at Asheville, UNCA. And that project fell apart after I had made 6 portraits. So I had consulted with a friend of mine here who is a photography professor at ETSU, Eastern Tennessee State University. And her name's Tema Stouffer, very gifted art photographer in her own right. She's like, do your own thing. And so this time I invited members of the community to submit work based on their own definition of self. And I think within the LGBTQIA community, that's such a sort of ever-changing and very personal target for how somebody envisions who they are and how they want others to see them. So sort of the same idea, but a little bit different in that I didn't have to put the subject and the photographer together. The subject is the photographer. And so that was, very interesting. Again, we made recordings, and each of the portraits was accompanied by a narrative on the wall next to it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we also have an app for that, The Skin I'm in the App Store. I'll
make sure I link everything.
Free download in the App Store.
Yeah, I'll make sure I put in a link to all of the collections and stuff so people can check out what we're talking about as we're talking about it.
Right.
That was really neat. I'm super happy to be a part of that too. And the past couple that you've done, I've been a part of. I loved that I didn't focus on myself. Like I feel like most of the photographers did do more of a self-portrait structure. But I focused on a friend of mine and, their experience as a trans person and, living more non-binary and, their writing and their translation of my piece afterwards. So I sent them the photo and had them write about it and how it made them feel. And I think that's super powerful too for a photographer, just in general, to experience, and to have other people translate your work of them directly is really unique. Mm-hmm. Because I feel like not a lot of people are doing that in the photographic world. It's a lot of people translating, to themselves, like, this is how I view somebody, instead of, collaborating on the view between the people. So I think that collaboration between everybody is really interesting and really important. And I don't think enough people are doing it. I think that could also take out a lot of stigmatizing stuff in photography and in that realm in general of, how people are viewing other people, and we could move forward progressively in that. So I'm curious kind of what you think your next direction is going to be with that style of, exhibition.
Yeah. You did great work for both projects, and I really love what you did for the second project in particular. It was great. I just want to touch on the power of what you're talking about, because the first project I did, the Bold Beauty project, I could watch people walking around the gallery and reading and getting to know the women, and on opening night the women were there, and people were tearing up, like they were super moved by it. Mm-hmm. The Compassion project, the same thing. The subjects felt very empowered to be seen and to have their story told. And again, people visiting were very moved by it. In fact, the museum said they had never had as many people come through.
That was a huge attendance.
Any exhibit. So that felt like, okay, there's something really right is happening here.
I remember when you did, because I hosted the talk at the Leica store for the Bold Beauty project, and there was people standing all the way around. Like, every seat was full, and there was just like barely any standing room. Everybody was there for it, because I think that's also the power of collaboration. You get more reach,
100%.
Because everybody says, oh, I was part of this project. And if you have that times, 25 times 2 of all of those people saying that they're a part of something,
exactly.
There's such a wide spread instead of just one photographer, it gets way more of a spread that way. So I think it's really cool.
The last story I want to tell you about, like, moving people and like why this work matters so much to me, is at ETSU. We had a really great opening night, very well attended, but there was a group of young LGBTQIA kids that came up to me afterwards. They formed like a little semicircle around me. And I swear to God, I really almost cried. But they were like, we cannot thank you enough for this work, because we really see, they pointed to the back wall, which were some of my portraits of somebody in their 80s, an LGBTQIA trans woman, and said, oh my God, we can see now that we can be happy when we're older. Mm. And it really, I just was like, okay, mic drop. Like, this is why we do the work, is that, and again, that the other thing is the collaboration, like what you said. It's Bell Hooks, one of the quotes from Bell Hooks is about identifying, we meaning the queer community, having the power to identify ourselves before somebody else does. Mm-hmm. And so I think when a photographer can do this sort of work and collaborate with somebody and really lift somebody's visibility up and have their story be told, it's really, it's a pretty cool thing.
I think what's cool too about that project is that I feel like a lot of the portrayal of queer people in that show was also very positive, where I feel like in media, something that seems like the representation leans towards like documenting trauma, or like, you know, it's a kind of a negative connotation. It's always like the disaster that it is to be a queer person, and that's what we have to talk about, versus the work in your show. It was really uplifting to the people in those portraits. So I appreciate that a lot too, as far as representation goes. And I feel like that's something I try to do that in my work. I don't want it to be like a traumatic image every time I, you know, showcase some type of documentary of a queer person. I want it to be really powerful and really, you know, I want people to look at them and almost be jealous of them in a way, is kind of what I...
Right, to see that there's joy to be had. You know, we're all, the human complexity is that we're all things.
Yeah.
And certainly I think for young people sort of coming to who they are and their own identity can be a very difficult journey. And in a lot of cases, young people can lose their families because they don't accept them. So it is hard and difficult. But, you know, I almost called This Skin I'm In the Joy Project, because someone had done a project here in Asheville, and every image was somebody had taken a marker and written on the face like ignored, broken, you know, sort of exactly what you're talking about, the negative connotations, which are true. But I just felt like, let's also show that you can be a joyful...
Like the only representation that we have of queer people sometimes can end up being so traumatizing.
Right.
So I don't know. I appreciate the kind of like twist on that.
Thanks.
But I mean, you've done that in every project, which is really cool. It's like every single, you know, collective you've put together is shining things in a positive light, you know. And the Compassion Project too, seeing the people be able to exist after the things that they've gone through and be able to be portrayed as these really beautiful, strong, empowered women. It's super important. So yeah, I really appreciate that a lot.
It's the humanity in all of us. You know, we're all these sort of complicated packages, but, you know, working with those women in the prison, I was like, this could be my auntie, my neighbor, my sister. I mean, they were really lovely people that had had some very hard early times in their lives. That,
And
anyway.
I mean that comes down to the system too. And there's so much that we could talk about that. But that would have to be another episode probably. But I just really appreciate the positivity that you bring to all of your collections. Do you have an idea of what you're gonna
you just
touch on
that.
next?
So I have an idea. I don't know how it's going to go, and it might not even be something that gets put up anywhere. It just might be personal work. But I feel like there are a lot of people, especially in the last few years, that do work to help other people. You know, they're doing very major heavy lifting. I think about calling it like the sorrow carriers, based on an old myth where people would walk around during the day with these large baskets, and people would dump their sorrows and their troubles into the basket. And the sorrow carriers at night would go to the edge of a lake and dump it all and then start their work again the next day. If you think about the people in our everyday lives that sort of bear sorrows or help people with their sorrows, it could be therapists and school teachers and doctors and nurses and you know, just a variety of people that probably social workers and people that work in prisons and you know, the list goes on and on. There's so many people like that in our communities that we don't, I mean, do we know their stories? Do we know how this affects them? Why did they even start this work? And so that might be the next area.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine. There's people that I think about, like, you know, people who work in funeral homes and prep like bodies and stuff like that. Like, I can never imagine that kind of job, and then to go home and just live a normal life, like just going to Walmart and grocery shopping after you've worked in that environment. I can't even imagine. So that's interesting.
Yeah, well, you know, you think about our lives. We've all been through a lot, you know, a lot of trauma and whatever, and then there are people that help you sort of get through it. And,
they witness that trauma every single day.
My God, I have a friend here in Asheville that does guardian ad litem work, and she also is the executive director of a homeless organization. She's a retired attorney, And I just hear her stories and I go, my God, you know, this woman deserves to be lifted up for her work and have her story be told. And, you know, for anybody that goes in that kind of work, it comes from some place within you that has a need to be fixed. So,
right.
You know, it's to me always very, very interesting, the multi-layers of who we are as people.
Mm-hmm. And are you wanting to make that like a group project, or would you do it on your
I have
own?
no idea. I think the Skin I'm In has got some legs. It's been in 3 places now, and I'm going to try and travel that a little more. Usually projects come to me through some personal experience. You know, the Skin I'm In is because I have a non-binary kid. So that was sort of what touched me off. And the prison project was because I was volunteering in the prison. So, you know, we'll see what happens with the next one. I don't know what's going to push me. I think I need a little rest.
Yeah, that's not a bad thing, though.
It was a big project.
No, it was huge. How long did you work on it total?
A year.
A year.
On the Skin I'm In, it was a year.
Yeah. So you mentioned your non-binary kid. Mm-hmm. I think let's unpack it a little bit.
What would you like to talk about?
Yeah, I want to know kind of how that, I mean, obviously that's impacted your work because you've launched yourself into this collection, but I feel like, is that helping you maybe understand more of what they go through, you know, on the daily basis? Is that something that you're kind of trying to work through, you know, through the work? Is that something that you feel like is maybe helping you? And
yeah, I think that, you know, I'm a much older sort of white, cis, female, straight, you know, and I'm very open-minded and I have been my whole life. But I think that when your kid comes to you and says, well, this is now my life and it might continue to change, you know, who knows? I mean, maybe my kid will end up being a trans kid someday, but whatever it is, what I want to do is be the person who really understands it. And so when I started working on the UNCA project here in the oral histories, I was photographing people in their 80s. I photographed a trans woman exactly my age, 64, and ages all the way down. And what I really learned in talking with so many different people is that each experience is so unique and so different, and that I think sort of in the straight world and sort of the straight, older, maybe not so exposed world of people, that we have these tropes, you know, you're gay or you're straight. The whole non-binary trans conversation for them is so difficult. So, you know, I feel like the more I know, the more I can share with the people that I know and care about so that they have a better understanding. And not everybody cares as much as I do because they're just not faced with it in their families. But all these projects always make me sort of a little bit of a better person, I think. So that's the goal. That's the goal. That was the goal in this one, is to really educate myself more so I can be sort of a better parent.
Yeah, that's awesome. No, I mean, I definitely think that you provide a safe space for everybody involved. Did you have any negative reaction to your show or any type of negative feedback?
Oh, gosh. I'm going to say none that I know of.
Okay.
But I'm sure there were plenty. I think, okay, so imagine, you know that this is a show of queer artists about queer bodies and queer words and queer feelings. So I think the people that were there either wanting to know more, friends of, family of, or people in the community. So I think in this project in particular, it was probably not so much. Perhaps with the Compassion Project, there may have been, we got a lot of, public interest in Miami. You know, I did several interviews. It was in the newspaper, and I'm sure there was negative feedback. But, you know, for me, I'm not trying to convince anybody to accept and love any particular group of people. I'm wanting for people to just be exposed and understand more the human underneath whatever package or label that you want to place on somebody. I mean, honestly, working with formerly incarcerated women while they were incarcerated, then getting to know them as they came out, I mean, it really changed the way that I would look at anybody who's been incarcerated.
Right.
And my belief in the justice system, and then the second chances that people deserve, and then the complications related to that, and the public services. It just changed me as a citizen of the world, or certainly in my community. And I think the whole thing with the LGBTQIA platform, it's like you don't have to even know anybody who's LGBTQIA, but if you went in there and you could read the stories of each person, some of the stories were sad, some were difficult, some were joyful, some were really embracing of who they were. So getting to know who people are in their full capacity of feelings. You know, I think we live in a society where vulnerability is not accepted, you know, and this is sort of very vulnerable art.
Yeah.
You know, vulnerable photography, you know, photography for social change. If you're doing portrait work and getting people to tell their personal stories, it's very vulnerable.
Yeah.
So.
No, I mean, I think the exposure is super interesting. If you think of, I mean, even now I'm 26, and I know we talked about this the other night, that when I went to college, I met my first trans person. You know, I never knew anybody in 18, 19 years who was trans that I knew of, at least, you know, and especially not open. And I feel like I know that I can't be the only one, you know, it's a normal thing that people don't have that exposure. So kind of changing that exposure and changing that narrative for people is super important. But I mean, in general too, like I don't think that I really knew anybody before the Compassion Project who had been formerly incarcerated, and sitting down with them and, you know, talking to them and realizing like, okay, this is a person. This is a normal, like very normal person. It does change your perspective. But the exposure is super, super important.
And I think even back to the the LGBTQIA, the Skin I'm In, Visual Narrative of Self project, I think it sort of gives people the freedom to say, oh, you mean I don't have to pick a binary?
Right.
I don't have to be this or that. I can be a little of this and a little of that. And I think if we can I call it letting down our guardrails on the language we use. Like so many people are against the they, them pronoun. I don't, you know, it's sort of one of my favorite conversations to have with people. If we could just loosen our tightly guarded definitions and binaries and ideas of who people should be and what a good person is or a bad person.
And in general, I mean, these people have existed always.
And throughout time.
Yeah.
In all cultures.
Yeah. And there's so much to be said about that too. And even like native cultures, I don't know if you've heard the conversation of like Two-Spirit and everything. Like it crosses everybody and it crosses history, but we just don't talk about it enough. There's another podcast that you should listen to. I don't know if you've heard about it. I'll have to link it below. I think it's called like History is Really Gay. And it's where they like unpack, you know, different periods and how, you know, the gay activities that were happening. But yeah, it's always been around, but it's the fact, especially in Western culture, that I feel like we're not exposed as much to it as we should be in certain parts of the country. And Deep South is going to be probably it's number one of that list.
Super interesting living in this area. You know, it's a real education for me. It's funny to me to think about how people really dig their heels in about their ideas about things. I mean, we all do sort of to some extent. And I find that the older I get, I have much looser sort of definitions and guardrails around the way I think about things. And God, so grateful for it. You know, I just get to, you know, experience the world a little more broadly.
Do you feel like moving here, I mean, I know you love Asheville, but do you feel like moving to North Carolina has changed kind of your conversation around these topics versus the conversations that you would have in Miami, or?
You know, I don't think so. I guess we didn't say I moved here from Miami 2 years ago, born and raised in Miami. I don't think the conversations are different. I do feel that Asheville's one of the queerest friendly towns I've ever lived in. But I think I had a group of friends in Miami who were fairly open. Maybe my friends here are a little more open. Yeah, I think the conversation isn't different. I think the acceptable level of queer folk is much better here than it was in Miami. But I don't know, it could be my community. Again, I just did a deeper dive here than I did in Miami.
It's super interesting. Yeah, I mean, Miami, you have it's a very mixed bag. So,
Yes, it is.
I feel like there's definitely a queer community. It's kind of more underground, I think, in Miami versus here. It seems to be very surface level and you can find it pretty easily.
Part of the culture.
Yeah.
Part of the culture.
There's something pretty easy to find here. But that's interesting too, to think about the two different locations. But you said you wanted to travel the show. Are you wanting to kind of push that in maybe more like deep South areas or?
Yes. We have had interest for this show to travel to Knoxville and Kentucky.
Okay.
So I have to reach out to a woman at ETSU who I've been working with, who was the curator for the ETSU show, and see what the contacts are and start pushing into that. But sort of took a break over the holidays.
Yeah. I feel like this would also be a good show to have in like colleges. And
it's a perfect college show. And we were also at a community college in Virginia.
okay.
At the same time we were at ETSU. So, yeah.
So it's moving around.
It is moving around, and it's a whole nother level of learning for me. How to make that happen.
Yeah.
You know?
So you're talking about moving around this project now. The other projects I notice are kind of closed books. Like, would you ever kind of reopen and move around those shows as well if somebody came to you about it, or?
Well, I think the Compassion Project was made specifically for a nonprofit organization I was working for, so I sort of feel it's their project. It certainly would be a template I could apply in any other city for sure. I mean, really, when I was in Miami during the Compassion Project, I worked with Miami-Dade College and did a presentation there, and also did a presentation at a high school, and actually came up with a guideline on how to make your own social justice project, and gave it out to anybody who was interested. And I think it's really important for everybody to know that even in your if you're a high school student and you're a photographer, you can pick a little community within your school that you want to sort of uplift and highlight and have that story be told. It's something we could all do in our communities and in our lives, in whatever sort of complexity you want to dive into doing.
Nice. Yeah. Kind of my other question is more going to be about like navigating the industry as a woman. How do you feel about that?
You know, it's interesting because I don't feel like I've had to navigate the industry. I've been super lucky that I sort of do these projects on my own. I may work with an organization or a nonprofit agency or a company, but it's really me in charge of my thing. So I really haven't had, the 2 times that I was in, or the 3 or 4 times I've been in gallery spaces, I've always worked with curators that I've had 0 problems with. I worked with Lex Turnbull here, which you might be interviewing at Revolve, and Lex was a dream to work with.
Yeah.
And Uni in Miami was a dream curator, and Carlotta at ETSU. Funny, they were all like non-binary or females, so maybe it's I just haven't worked with men.
Yeah. I mean, that's great.
Yeah, really, I haven't had any issues, but again, I don't actually navigate the industry. I'm not working I am working for a newspaper now, the Asheville Watchdog, to give a little plug, and I'm their photojournalist, which is my first foray into doing it. And it's really delightful. I just recently had a little question about the way they were formatting my images on the digital paper, and the managing editor was like, "No problem," and switched it. And
amazing.
it's an amazing group. So maybe I've just been really lucky.
Yeah. No, that to me it sounds pretty lucky.
I know it's not representative of the general population.
No, but it's
photographers
it's good
and women photographers.
It's good to hear though.
Yeah.
And also too, I mean, that's something to be said with working with like queer people and women in, in your projects and how smooth everything can go as well. But yeah, so you started photography more of, more of pleasure than work, right? Like you weren't doing it as a full-time income.
No. I was a full-time mom at the time I started. Kids were getting ready to go off to university, and I was running that little business with my friend, the location business for photo and film. And I just loved the camera, and I made all the images for the website. We had over 100 homes and, many photos for each home, and started working with photographers on a daily basis. And I was like, I really love this. I think I could do this.
Yeah.
So that's when I started self-teaching and then taking classes. And
now here we are.
And here we are, yeah. I have not had to rely on it as my full-time income. And I'm sort of grateful for that because I think I'm too old. You have much more energy than I do to do weddings. I will say I've done weddings for the last year and have decided to not do them next year.
It is exhausting.
It's exhausting. It's exhausting.
I don't know when my expiration date will be for events, but I can say it's pretty overstimulating. Like I come home and I want to hear nothing. Right. And I operate the full day with earplugs in because it's so overstimulating. I have to hear as little as possible throughout the whole day.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, I can imagine as you're, moving up in age, it can be a little much. But yeah, I mean, that's great though that everything has been more of a passion project to you instead of it being like a forced work project. I feel like that makes a difference.
I did other work for that.
Yeah.
I had other careers that were sort of, work you had to do to survive versus passion project.
Yeah. If you went back in time, would you ever change about anything that you did with your career?
Oh, 100%. I would have either been a psychologist or a photographer.
Yeah. For
sure, without a doubt. I just... we were talking about that this morning. I just really did not feel like I had, I didn't have it in me. I didn't have a lot of guidance, and I had very little self-confidence to sort of think of myself as being something other than, just little old me. But I'm a changed person now. I'm very proud of the work I've been doing, and I see how it affects people, and I'm like, fully complete about it.
I think that's something that's super important to me, even with my age, is kind of being a representation of, you can choose your own life. So I think a lot of people like to sit back and kind of complain about what they aren't doing or what they're not able to do and stuff. And I feel like everybody can do it and it's possible. You just have to actually do it.
Oh, you're the finest example of that,
I want this project, this podcast too, to also be an example of, all the different ways that you can do it, because you're curating, you're doing collections and you're photographing, you have so many branches of what you do. It's not just limited to one thing, you're not just a portrait photographer.
Oh yeah. I think I'm very much a generalist. I'm not like exquisitely good at any one thing, but I'm really good at a lot of little things. And so, I just feel like if we could all decide within our own worlds what we're good at and do it, and then also see like, how can I use what I'm good at to make a little bit of a difference? And I think things have been so shitty for so many years, and that so many of us are just exhausted. I almost said effing exhausted, but I think you all know what I mean. I just think if we could all, instead of feel overwhelmed by how bad everything is just say, okay, I can do this one thing in my little community.
Or even for myself too.
Even for myself.
Yeah, yes, even if it's not even if it's for nobody but yourself too, I think is super important. And
that affects people around you.
Yeah,
it does,
I think
everybody
is just swimming in corporate America. It's the swimming pool we're in.
Break away, people.
Yeah, free yourself.
Unless you love it, and then keep doing it.
Yeah, that's
okay too.
Yeah, we won't judge you
but
too hard.
This is a podcast about artists and creativity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm super proud of the work that you're doing. Proud of you as a person and in your age bracket to be as forward as you are and as progressive as you are. And I'm honored to know you and work with you.
Oh, thank you, honey.
But with that, I mean, unless there's anything
No.
else that
No.
you'd like to say, my only other question is not related to the podcast at all. It is your most played song or your most listened to or favorite song ever.
I knew you were going to ask me this, and I was going to look up the song. It's an old Rod Stewart song when he was with Faces, and I don't remember the name, but I will tell you my two new favorite artists, Seth Walker from this area, amazing dude, great music, and Trevor Hall. Those are my two current.
Oh yeah, you played me Trevor Hall the other night. That was really nice.
Sort of, yeah.
Okay, so
stations.
I'm going to be making a playlist, and
I will find both those songs for you.
So everybody's going to be contributing to the playlist that's on the show. So that'll be accessible on my Spotify, which is going to be cute. So I think we'll have a really wide range of music to listen to by the end of this year.
I love it.
But yeah, thank you so much for being on the
Thanks
show.
for having me as your first. I feel honored.
Yeah, I'm super excited. So this has been the Little Art Studio podcast, episode 1.
Signing off.